First, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for such a provocative subject. It is not often enough that those of us who work with non-Western objects are asked to think deeply about the nature of excellence in our field. To the Friends of the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas here at the museum, I salute your vision in sponsoring such a symposium. I want to give an especially warm thank you to our hosts, Jill D'Alessandro, Christina Helmick, and Matthew Robb. Today I will be focusing on the role of one object type and its place in the pre-Columbian canon. These objects are called yokes, an unfortunate misnomer that we are likely never to be rid of, so we'll just go with it. Regardless of the name, these objects are some of the most impressive portable sculptures created by ancient Americans. They are consistently over a foot long and weigh over 40 pounds. We will see that yokes are in fact costume elements, a key category of art objects for pre-Columbian peoples, who were very attached to the social status that these objects bestowed. The yoke is one of the largest and most sophisticated costume elements in the entire pre-Columbian repertory, and for that reason, among others, has become one of a handful of canonical object types that every survey and every important museum collection, including this one, must take into account. So let us pull back from the yoke for a moment and situate it in the great expanse of pre-Columbian art. Good. As many of you know well, the pre-Columbian peoples created two regions of urban culture and the sophisticated art styles that go along with such culture. Mesoamerica, as you see on the top here, or the area of high culture between Mexico and Honduras, and the Andes, centered mainly on modern-day Peru on the bottom. The pre-Columbian canon has been built mainly around these two areas. The yoke tradition that concerns us today was created by Mesoamerican artists, so it is this area that we will focus on. Now, Mesoamerican artists created a rich range of forms, including colossal stone heads weighing 20 tons, seen here in San Francisco recently to great effect in the Olmec show, to jade costume ornaments that you see on the lower right, the latter central to the idea of rulership throughout much of Mesoamerican history, and brought to a zenith by the classic Maya peoples, building on the accomplishments of Olmec stone carvers in the eyes of most connoisseurs. The Olmec are a rather late entrant into the Mesoamerican canon. It has only been in the last 60 years or so that Olmec has existed as a discrete style and civilization. Now, for much of the past, and certainly by the 19th century, Mesoamerican art was divided into Maya, Aztec, and the rest. Art styles outside the Maya and Aztec were considered either minor and/or inferior styles. Given the richness of Mesoamerica and its art traditions, this hierarchy was bound to produce counter-narratives. To cite only the most important example, Esther Pastori argued for an appreciation of the Teotihuacan style in the great show Teotihuacan, Art from the City of the Gods, held here in the early 1990s. But her lament on the misunderstandings and underappreciation of that critical style actually only proves my point. With a historiography that privileges the Aztec and Maya in mind, let us return to this yoke, which fits neither in the Aztec nor the Maya category. Perhaps a look at the physical material of the piece can give us an entree to thinking through its value and place. The material from which these objects were made were important to pre-Columbian peoples in both type and amount. Carved from a single block of stone, they are often in a greenstone, which would have made them inherently valuable. All pre-Columbian peoples north of Honduras and Nicaragua value greenstone, and as we'll see, it's because it's a greenstone culture, much like many cultures in Asia, and not a gold culture as in the old world. Now, greenstone was the currency of elite throughout ancient Mesoamerica, the already mentioned region of pre-Columbian urban civilizations that stretched from what is today northern Mexico to Honduras and El Salvador in Central America. The center of yoke production was on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, largely encompassed by the modern state of Veracruz. Yokes were produced from about the turn of our era, or about the year 1 to 1000, or through the entire first millennium CE. Elaine Marquise, a connoisseur of these objects, has closely studied a related tradition found on the south coast of Guatemala and adjacent areas. Can I do this? Yes, I can. So Elaine has worked in this area, but we're going to be focusing on what I think Elaine would agree is the heartland of the production of these yokes. Another view of the same object seen earlier shows off the coloring and patina of the stone. This yoke was collected very early, probably sometime in the 1840s or 1850s, and acquired by the British Museum in the 1860s, where it remains today. This piece seems to be about the only thing of great value in a diplomat's collection, most of which was acquired as a lot at a Sotheby's auction around 1860. The price was £382, at the time a staggering sum, especially when you think that most of it was not certainly at the level of this piece. The diplomat, Percy William Doyle, was one of the first to be posted to an independent Mexico from Britain. He seems to have acquired the yoke while on diplomatic mission in Mexico City between 1848 and 1858. As we will see a little later, the posting of a diplomat to Mexico seems to have led more than just this Mr. Percy to the acquisition of a very fine yoke. The yoke is typical in showing the frontal face of a zoomorph with the eyes framed by a scroll above and a conventionalized snout. Here's the scroll frame, here's an eye, a very conventionalized snout, and then this is the slit mouth and a lolling tongue. This is a classic iconographic schema for these objects. This zoomorph, which is what it is based mainly on the toad, but pre-Columbian artists and thinkers had a penchant for combining natural features of several other species into one supernatural entity. In any case, the iconography of yokes are rarely their most interesting or prized aspect, although there are isolated examples of great iconographic sophistication, including the one on display here at the San Francisco Museum. Or the de Young Museum. Instead of iconography, what I will argue has long been of interest to art historians and connoisseurs is the particularly fine combination of sculptural form and graphic detail seen in a number of these yokes. So let's look at another one. And again, you can look at 2, 3, or 50 of these, and many of these are going to be showing exactly the same sorts of structural details. Where's my little, there it is. Here are the tab eyes. The conventionalized snout, the slit mouth, the lolling tongue, all there. The greenstone color, the finish, gorgeous, of course. Now, what's interesting about this one, and this is at the Museo Nacional de Antropología y Historia in Mexico City, is this incision that's laid onto the plastic three-dimensional forms. And this is really a hallmark of the finest pieces, those most valued in collections throughout the world. And as you might imagine, the National Museum in Mexico City has a splendid collection of yokes and related portable stone objects. Here's a vitrine. And this is just a sort of tip of the iceberg. There are many, many more in the bodegas in Mexico City attached to the museum. Several have this combination of three-dimensional form and incised line that we identified above as a hallmark of the most aesthetically powerful and highly valued pieces. So let's travel north a bit to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And we can see in this particular example the same combination of firmly seized conventionalized three-dimensional forms and this incredibly elegant incision scroll detailed. And here's a close-up of this. And what makes this piece the masterpiece, the master work of what we have so far been able to find in this genre is this combination of strap work of a raised low relief ground onto which this incredibly elegant arabesque or scroll incision is laid, and all of this is laid onto just a classic conventionalized toad zoomorph that we have seen earlier. Here's another one, also AMNH, and this is again the three-dimensional classic sort of figure. with the incised, really wonderful incised scroll work on the surface of the object. This is just a skeletal head that has been inserted into the classical zoomorph here. The style was dubbed Classic Veracruz by the great Tatiana Proskuriukov, more of whom later. But what is really remarkable is just the American Museum of Natural History. It's got by far the finest collection of these objects in the United States, and some would say it's really the finest collection in the world. Now, the problem is, how did this come about? And it really begins not at the AMNH, but at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Met hosted and later purchased this large collection of Mexican antiquities. You actually see it on display. That's just a little notice in a New York newspaper about the display of this very large and important collection that was assembled by the important Italian diplomat. He's got a whole other listing in the history of diplomacy between Europe and Mexico, but one of the things he did while he was there in the 1880s is assemble a most amazing collection of pre-Columbian art. And he brings it to New York in the 1890s, and it is soon showing at the Metropolitan. Again, diplomacy seems to spur the creation of a major collection. Unlike the patrons of Mr. Percy in Britain, however, the Met drove quite a hard bargain, and Mr. Petitte, who had borrowed significant amounts of money on the collection, was left ruined and died not long after in a tenement in New York. At his death, he was hard at work on a revolutionary sort of battery to power the automobiles that were then becoming popular. Although it is not clear in this picture, the most important and valuable part of this collection by far was the classic Veracruz collection, and specifically the numerous yokes that he had obtained in Mexico in the 1880s. We know nothing, sadly, of his collecting history or with whom he was working, or there is no paper that I've ever been able to find on Luigi Petitte in Mexico and his collecting. Lots of diplomatic history, but nothing on his collecting. In the early part of the 20th century, then, these took pride of place at the Met, but interestingly, already by 1840, they and the other Mexican antiquities had fallen out of favor. The Metropolitan story ends with this rather brief but shocking missive from early 1914. The Metropolitan loaned the entire Petitte collection that they had recently purchased, along with some ceramics, to the American Museum of Natural History. What this doesn't state, however, what this little missive doesn't state, is that in return, the Metropolitan was to receive on long-term loan the entire collection of Chinese antiquities amassed by the American Museum of Natural History. In a telling series of letters leading up to this exchange, the directors of each institution made it clear that the line between civilization and primitive had become muddled by the place of these two collections, pre-Columbian and Chinese. Chinese art and civilization was now seen as akin to the old world, while pre-Columbian art had fallen from artistic grace rather quickly, I would add, and was being recategorized as primitive, or at least not the thing that the Metropolitan should be displaying and collecting. The Chinese collections were seen to be more comfortable in the temple of art that is the Metropolitan, while the pre-Columbian collections would be more appropriate across Central Park in the temple of anthropology that is the AMNH. With a few notable exceptions, this was to set the tone for the next 50 years in which pre-Columbian art was the province of anthropological museums, while Chinese art was housed in great art museums. And here is a quote from a document sent between the two that I think sort of sums up exactly what was going on. This is a Mr. Osborne from the AMNH writing to his colleague DeForest at the Met. And that sort of does it, you know. And it's sort of interesting. This is where the world is being cut up. I mean, it's between, they're saying between historical and non-historical peoples, because I believe that is a sort of scholarly, or it's a verifiable fact, at least to some extent. Of course, this changes later in the 20th century. But this was the way they were doing it. But it's really about civilization and barbarism, or civilization and primitivism. So, returning to the superb AMNH collection, of Gulf Coast portable stone sculpture, you should know that almost none of it belongs to the AMNH, but it's all the Petitte Collection, the long-term loan from the Met that we've seen above. Now, there are a few pieces, but in the great majority, it is the Petitte Collection, which must have been just mind-boggling. At one point, these pieces were to be the heart of a great art collection, but by 1914, they had become anthropology. And anthropologists were interested above all in symbolism and function. These strange U-shaped objects were a great target for scholarship interested in function. The curator in charge of these objects at the AMNH, Gordon Ekholm, was able to link these objects firmly to the Mesoamerican rubber ball game and their attendant rituals. What we see here is the tying of the yoke, and here, this is one figure. Here's eyes, nose, mouth, the profile here, and his attendant is tying on one of these objects. This is an early, quite important low-relief stela, a large-scale sculpture from our Gulf Coast region. This gives a good idea of how it was worn with the curved side on one hip and the open side on the other. Interestingly, this is a very early example of art from what would become our classic Veracruz region, which is directly comparable to the graphic narrative style developed at the same time in the Maya area. And I'm about to bring it back to this question of Maya, Aztec, and the rest. It is from depictions such as these, as well as the depiction of yokes on ceramic figures, that scholars were able to identify the wearing of the yoke and eventually connect it to the Mesoamerican rubber ball game. After 80 years in the public eye, the yoke finally became a costume element in the principal Mesoamerican sporting event. We have largely ignored this fascinating story here in the interest of time, and that's really a whole other series of talks. But it will not surprise you that it was the curator at the American Museum of Natural History, Gordon Ekholm, who defined this iconography and the function of the yoke in the late 1940s while working with the former Petitte Collection. To return to this low-relief sculptural style, it was not classic Veracruz artists, but the Maya who were to push this narrative graphic style further than any other ancient American people with their now famous tradition of stela and lintels. The classic Veracruz people, although they could do this and would from time to time, really gave themselves over, beginning about 300, to the three-dimensional sculptural tradition embodied in the yoke. With the great collections of yokes moved from the Met to the AMNH and the scholarly interest shifting from iconography or shifting from appreciation and connoisseurship to iconography and function, the yoke largely passed into art historical oblivion for the next half-century. This did not deter some collectors, such as Robert Woods Bliss, who eventually amassed an important but small collection of Gulf Coast portable sculpture from this period, including the yoke that you see here. His collection became that of Dumbarton Oaks, where this yoke still resides. Bliss especially seems to have been attentive to the possibilities of an idealizing portrait tradition in these works. And then this is another view of that style. And if you look at his collections of classic Veracruz, he seems to be especially interested in this idealizing portrait head style. But despite the allure of these heads, the great figural tradition in Mesoamerica is not classic Veracruz, but the Maya. There is no other tradition that portrays the figure as dynamically or with the amount of naturalistic detail. Maya art is very well represented in the canon of pre-Columbian art and long has been. The general museum and art world public is much less aware of the Gulf Coast material we have been examining. In short, I have yet to make the larger argument about the inclusion of the finest classic Veracruz material in the canon of pre-Columbian art. Our time is short, so I will make this argument from authority. The foundational art historian and epigrapher Tatiana Proskuryakov had two great pre-Columbian loves, classic Maya and classic Veracruz art. It is somewhat ironic, given the Metropolitan's efforts to write off pre-Columbian art in 1914 as not historical, that it was Tatiana who in the late 1950s was instrumental in deciphering Maya hieroglyphic writing and making that art an historical one after all. She was too late to convince the trustees of the Metropolitan of the historicity of the pre-Columbian tradition or of the value of her other love, classic Veracruz. Proskuryakov's careful delineation of style and motif in classic Veracruz art, for first published in 1954, and a page of which you see here, still serves as the fundamental publication of the subject. Now, many of these drawings were not actually Tatiana Proskyrykov's, but this is her publication, and she actually was the first one to really parse the style. By the time of the Met's 1970 blockbuster exhibit of pre-Columbian art entitled Before Cortez, the best yoke specimens were firmly ensconced in the pantheon of pre-Columbian art masterpieces, or they were canonical. This is due in no small part to the work of Proskyryakov and Ekholm, as well as the rise of a new generation of connoisseurs. At the same time, the combination of incision and plasticity found on these objects was questioned, as many yokes found archaeologically are plain or have very simple plastic decoration. The hypothesis then was that yokes were originally found with only plastic decoration and then doctored with classic Veracruz scroll-style incisions to increase their value, of course. While this may be true in particular cases, I have grave doubts about the ubiquity of such a claim. Optimal combinations appear very early, like in this 1907 publication from the Bureau of American Ethnology, where it's clear that you have this canonical combination of three-dimensional plasticity and linear decoration. Recently, and just to sort of add to that argument, recently the lower portion of a stunning palace structure was unearthed at the premier site associated with classic Veracruz sculpture, El Tajin. Mural motifs directly associated with the sort of incisions seen in greenstone and other yokes appear in this palace structure. And this is difficult to see, I know, so let's go a little closer, but it's this sort of, the black line then serves to trace the same sorts of decorative motifs that we see on the greenstone yokes. There's even those idealized heads that appear in the same way. I don't know if you see this eye, this nose, and this mouth so firmly seized, beautifully drawn in this calligraphic line here. So really you see the same sort of artistry in these murals with a lot of the same sort of stylistic parameters that we see on the yokes themselves. So I'm going to attempt a summary here. When this piece appeared in England in the 1860s, the classic Veracruz style was as yet unnamed, and the yoke as an object type was unknown. Towards the end of the 19th century, a great collection of these objects appeared in New York and eventually joined the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Within 20 years of the acquisition of the collection, however, the Metropolitan Board deemed it more appropriately housed in the Anthropology Museum across Central Park. Here began the yoke's sojourn as anthropological artifact. This led, admittedly, to the brilliant work on the symbolism and function of the yoke by the anthropologist and curator Gordon Ekholm, leading eventually to its identification as a costume element in the pageantry of the Mesoamerican ballgame. That part of the story we were only able to touch on today. The Before Cortez show at the same Metropolitan Museum in 1970, with an entire section dedicated largely to classic Veracruz and several superb yoke examples, may serve as a marker for the yoke's ascension to canonical status. And it is with this exhibition that I must end our exploration of the yoke and in the canon of pre-Columbian art. Thank you.